So,
Hello and welcome to this video. I'm very pleased to have one of my patrons here with me, Mr. John Phillips. Is it Mr. John Phillips or Dr. John Phillips?
well, you can call me Doctor or Mister. I really don't mind.
I'd rather call you Doctor, it sounds much better. It gives you an air of authority on this
Indeed.
subject, which we're about to talk about, and that is the subject of postmodernism. So, this is something that crops up on my channel all the time. Many artists will reel this off, many critics of identity politics will reel this off. It gets blamed for all sorts of things, and recently, um, Dr. John here, who had been lurking on my Patreon for some time, just watching quietly, then got in touch and he said, I'm a little bit of an expert in this. I've got some knowledge, and it would be nice to have a chat about it. Which I'm very pleased to be educated by someone who obviously knows a little bit more. So, do you want to just tell us what your background is, John, and how you come to have some ideas on postmodernism?
Sure. I should say that I was a very late starter in academia. I am a doctor, but I didn't get my doctorate until I was well into my 30s, probably closer to 40 by the time I got it.
Mm,
I have a previous career in music. Um, I started a prog band when I was still at school, more or less. That became a punk band. And then that sort of verged into sort of, I don't know, post-punk jazz experimentation. And then, of course, there was no money, so I had to give that up and go to university. And that's basically the story of me becoming a university doctor. Um,
and what did you play?
I was a guitar player.
And what were your influences guitar wise?
Well, that's quite interesting. As an 8-year-old, I found an old record in the back of my parents' collection, which wasn't very big. They weren't
Mm,
particularly wrapped up in music, but this old record was a sort of a torn. I don't know where they got it from. I'm sure they didn't go out and buy it. A torn version of Charlie Parker's um, famous memorial concert. Um, which included Now's the Time. I mean, it was called
mm,
Memorial album, and it included Now's the Time and Billy's Bounce and those sorts of things. And I became infected by the jazz bug by listening to this as an 8-year-old. So that was there.
mm,
My dad, who's a journalist, took me, an excuse for him to go, really, I suppose, to the Isle of Wight Festival, 1970. And we were in the press um, partition right at the beginning in front of the stage. And I saw the Moody Blues, I saw Free, I saw Jimi Hendrix, I saw a lot of people who afterwards I just had no concept of where life could be except on that stage. So that really got me going as a musician. And it wasn't until much later that I realized I needed to pick up some other kind of skill.
mm,
Um, which is the other thing that I do is write. So I've always been a writer, and so the reason I went to university was to become a writer. Um, that is, a writer of fiction and poetry,
mm,
creative writing,
mm,
basically.
mm,
But I was hijacked. I would say I was hijacked by what people rather freely call postmodern philosophies of the time. Hence my response to the question of postmodernism. Um, Now, this is a lot more complicated, and I know you know that I was going to say this, but this is a lot more complicated than can be summarized easily. So I will
mm,
say one or two things about the atmosphere at the time in academia. And of course, as a mature student, you already think that you know a few things. So when you
mm,
come across these, you're coming across them not as a sort of naive, open uh,
mm,
category mind, but you're coming across them and resisting them and working with them in some way or another. Um, at that time in England, there wasn't much expertise in this field. Um, I mean, I came across Jacques Derrida 15 years after his early works had begun to emerge in Paris in the 60s, but no one really knew what to say. No one knew how to teach it. No one
mm,
really knew how to connect. They just said, "There's this stuff here. Do what you can with it." Um, and so I worked on that through my undergraduate days, and then deliberately went to Sussex University to study with the great and the good and the translators of Derrida and Foucault, and study with Homi Bhabha and the post-colonialists and all of this kind of thing. So I began to get a proper grounding in it as an MA student and then a PhD student, where I wrote, perversely enough, a PhD on Aristotle. And Aristotle is my main man, I should say, right? I think most of what we know about politics, about ethics, about art begins with some of the questions that Aristotle poses. So I think Aristotle or Plato
My
should
my
really be.
my definition of art, which I always parrot here, which is the sort of the Apollonian and the Dionysian, the balance between the two, and the sublime in the middle. I have to say, I know comes directly from Plato and Aristotle, really, isn't it? It's a very old definition of art.
But we owe that definition to Nietzsche, really. I mean, in the modern world, you wouldn't have picked this up simply from reading Aristotle or simply from
No.
reading Plato. It's a Nietzschean, very young Nietzsche reading of the tragedy of the time. He thought was about it. I mean, the thing about, I would say, postmodernism, if there is any postmodernism in philosophy, probably begins with Nietzsche. Because Nietzsche sets himself up so deliberately against Plato, and it's so obviously a reversal of the Platonic values and a reconfiguring of them under Nietzsche's own philosophical ideas, which are not always easy to understand. Um, and I say that not in a patronizing way. I mean, I don't get it half the time. I really don't. Very difficult stuff. But at his most polemic, it's quite clear. And Nietzsche was absolutely against morality. And that famous, his genealogy of morality is an attack on the idea of the tradition of morals we picked. But in that early book, in The Birth of Tragedy, where he defines the Dionysus and the Apollonian tension, he makes this kind of strange sentence, which I'll try to remember. The only justification for humankind must be aesthetic. Right? That's where he says that, which chimes with a lot of what you say, I think, too.
I've only ever read really one Nietzsche book, and
Which
it's
one?
Beyond Good and Evil.
Ah, yeah, much later and quite difficult.
Mm.
Um,
And Birth of Tragedy. Those are the two
that's
that
the
I've.
Birth of Tragedy is
Yeah, Birth of
where his stuff
Tragedy is,
comes out.
and I haven't read them all. What I'm saying is I've had a skim through, and I've read other books that have discussed those in depth. So those are the
Yeah,
two ones I've tried
yeah,
to get my head around. And like you say, I think my idea probably comes from Birth of Tragedy.
yeah. And
Yeah,
they come from different ends of his career too. I mean,
yeah,
he's much older when he writes Beyond Good and Evil. So anyway, I didn't really want to get into Nietzsche
mm,
because I find that that can be a bit distracting in all
mm,
kinds of ways. But I think the ideas that begin to emerge as a postmodern philosophy can very often be traced back to some of these strategies that you find in the Nietzschean philosophy. This is partly to do with the fact that the great champion of Nietzsche was Heidegger, Martin Heidegger. Martin Heidegger owes a great deal of his philosophy to Nietzsche. He owes a great deal of it to the German poet Hölderlin. Hölderlin was a roommate of Hegel and Schelling, two great German
mm,
idealist philosophers. But he didn't become a philosopher, he became a poet and a translator of ancient Greek tragedy. And Heidegger is completely wrapped up in trying to rethink Hölderlin and trying to rethink Nietzsche, who are like massive influences on his work. And I did promise I would say maybe something about truth, given that that's one of your
mm.
key questions, and I think quite rightly so. Of course, there isn't a philosopher in the world who hasn't questioned truth. And the analytic tradition is just as much of questioning about truth as the so-called continental tradition.
So, for people who aren't as up on philosophy, could you just describe briefly the analytical tradition and the continental tradition?
Okay, so round about the 1890s, the end of the 19th century, where previously most philosophy um, could be contained. There's a wonderful, wonderful book called 100 Years of Philosophy where you can read about this. It was written in about 1950, so it goes back 100 years from then.
Mm,
It's a wonderful book, um, and and you'll find that there's a moment at the end of the 19th century where um, philosophy is done in a new way, but it's also something that changes in relation to continental philosophy. So most philosophy at the time, let's just sum it all up as it was in some way Hegelian, right?
mm.
The great incomprehensible German
Yeah,
logician,
I've,
G.W.
I've
Hegel.
read quite a bit of him. I never understand anything he's going on about.
There's, I believe that I turned to philosophy after trying to make sense of not one of his papers, but a paper where they haven't been able to attribute the authorship. It's either Hölderlin, Hegel, or Schelling, and it's called the first manifesto of system idealism, or various other things, depending. And it's a fragment, and it just when I read it, it felt like a slap in the face. I mean, sometimes you read something and it just hits you
Mm,
so hard, you think, "Oh, there must be something going on here." And so, yes, of course, I read all of the Hegel, but there was a Hegelian philosopher at the end of the 19th century, coming from someone called Bradley, called Bertrand Russell. And Bertrand Russell decided he'd had enough of this Hegel, and there was a massive problem in Hegel, a huge one that he couldn't get over within the Hegelian philosophy. And that's the problem of relations. And so Bertrand Russell began to rethink philosophy from the ground up in with two or three colleagues. And so you get a sort of um, the great gods of analytic philosophy emerging around about this time, 1905. And these started doing philosophy in a very different way. Very short essays, very analytic, very precise. There's a wonderful essay by Bertrand Russell in the 1905 edition of Mind called On Denoting. And I think that was the first essay of its kind in that journal called Mind. And I think it must have changed things vastly. It's like something comes along and everything's different afterwards. Bertrand Russell was like that. Later on, of course, he became good friends with Wittgenstein, and the whole of analytic philosophy follows from that era. One thing I should say is it's not just British. I mean, Bertrand Russell was in communication with a German philosopher called Gottlob Frege. Gottlob Frege is a very, very important
mm.
logician, but he'd come up with um, a philosophy within set theory that allowed him to produce something like a complete logic, which is just a lovely thing, isn't it? I mean, if you think
Mm.
about it, if we can have a complete logic, then we can probably know everything because knowledge is governed by logic. And but Russell had found a flaw in Frege's thinking. He had found that there was a lurking paradox, and the lurking paradox is to do with various things, but
Is this
um,
like the categorical error? Is that
yeah.
what?
So
Yeah.
so if you have a set theory, then
Mm,
certain sets contain certain things, and other sets contain other things, right? So you can develop your set theory like
mm,
that. The set with all barbers in it, for instance,
mm.
the set of all barbers, this sort of thing. And that was an example that Russell liked to present later on in his life. There's a barber in the village who shaves everyone, but he does not shave himself. Who shaves the barber? So this is not a very good example on Russell's part of how the paradox in Frege's philosophy affected the entire logic, um, because it was the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. And I better not go on with this, but the set of all sets that do not contain themselves, does it contain itself? The answer is well, of course. But then at the same time, it's no, of course not. Um, and with this paradox, which seems trivial to us at this end of uh, the new century, seems trivial, changed everything. It changed the progress of at least mathematical logic because Russell wanted to logicize mathematics and on this basis couldn't. And the person who prevented him from doing that, or rather showed how it was not going to be possible, um, was a number of people, but we know them um, as the founders of what we call computability and computability logic. In other words, these paradoxes become less a matter of um, making it impossible to do logic properly. Rather, it opens up logic to future possibilities. And I think von Neumann and the invention of the so-called Neumann architecture in computing is owed precisely to people like Gödel, whose thesis showed that Russell's system could never be completed in a famous theorem, which is quite complicated, but roughly works in the same way by turning the system against itself. Um, and these important developments in analytic philosophy are reflected in continental philosophy. As continental philosophy is just as interested in how you can develop a system and what within that system prevents it from developing fully or prevents it from falling into paradox.
So I'd like to ask you something which is probably my ignorance, but I always felt that with Descartes and then Kant, there is this split which then goes towards Hegel, but also goes towards Hume and the English philosophers, and there's this idea of a sort of a rational, utilitarian, pragmatic philosophy running through, and then this sort of like Hegel running through to Husserl, running through to Heidegger, that sort of line of continental philosophy. But what you're stating is that actually the history is much more different, and the point you make about Bertrand Russell being a Hegelian originally is very interesting. And so is what you're saying quite counter to the mainstream narrative that these two camps.
I wouldn't say it's absolutely counter, but the mainstream history of philosophy, you take modern philosophy, you begin with Descartes. Now, this is actually something that only Descartes persuades us to do because he had a way with rhetoric to say, okay, well, look, here's a philosophy no one's ever seen before. It's completely brand new. But that was his rhetoric. His philosophy is very similar to Aristotle's. But I mean, obviously, it's got different terminologies, and the mind body problem and all of that kind of thing comes out of Descartes. And Descartes was quite empirical too. I mean, he sort of experimented with eyeballs that he had brought from the grave to see what would happen with light if you shone it through it, and this sort of thing. Descartes, so I love
Yeah.
Descartes, but by the time you get to Kant, now Kant has this famous phrase, doesn't he? It was Hume who woke me from my dogmatic slumbers. So Hume's rational empirical point of view, that's one of the loveliest books in the world, his book on human reason.
It's incredible. I really am influenced by Hume as much as I can understand
Yeah,
him. But and also within that rationalism seems embedded a very postmodernist idea of truth. It seems to be there, which links to morality and how morality cannot be absolute, and
yeah,
you know it's fascinating talking to you, and it's actually quite it's quite nice to feel that this could all be one great exploration of you know being and
sure.
existed, because and that everybody is actually working with each other and building on each other rather than a great big scrap going on, which we seem to see culturally being played out at the moment, isn't it? Uh, which for me, I know this sounds ridiculous, but it has its seems to have its roots in these philosophical battles that have gone on.
Yeah, I think so.
Um,
There's,
when I was at art college in the 1980s, and we were interested in it, we looked at postmodernism from an aesthetic point of view, which is why I've stuck up the big binocular building behind. You know, that's the way I came at postmodernism was through that route. Then I had the counter to that, and I could see a big row that was going on, and that was going on in our art college in the 1980s. That row seems to have expanded it out to all culture. Back in 1980, nobody outside our art college was bothered about these things. But and so, can you talk a little bit about how postmodernism, why there is that perceived break between analytical philosophy and then continental philosophy, and a little bit about phenomenology and critical theory, and because I'm trying to get you to do a sort of history of modern philosophy in about 15 minutes. I know you
Yeah,
can do it.
I do get that.
Yeah.
So let's jump ahead. Let's leave
Mm,
Kant and Hegel behind,
mm, yeah.
because this is what was happening. Now, now I think the problem with philosophy for philosophers at the end of the 19th century is metaphysics. Russell is very clear about this. Wittgenstein is very clear about this, but there's no one more metaphysics than Wittgenstein, let's face it.
Mm,
But metaphysics is the problem. We need to somehow divest philosophy of its metaphysics. Husserl was very clear about this. And Husserl wanted to establish, like Descartes, Descartes was Husserl's hero, really. Didn't have much thought for Kant. But what he wanted to do was establish first philosophy, which is to say, all these sciences have done incredibly well and developed into fully fledged systems of knowledge, but no one knows how the consciousness of the scientist works. And there's a problem for philosophy in that we do not yet understand how to study consciousness. So he wanted to turn philosophy back into the way of thinking, the life of the mind, as it were, as Hannah Arendt will later call it. And let's see how this really works. And I think this is very important for everything that follows, all postmodernism, everything, because his way of doing this was to say, okay, well, the life of the mind gazes out, always gazes, because they've got this fundamentally visual way of thinking
mm.
about perception, which will be a problem later. And I don't think we'll have time to talk about it, but I think it's something that would be worth
Well,
thinking.
if you want to come back, John, well, you will be
Yeah.
coming back because this is
Okay.
fascinating anyway.
So there's that the visual dominance in thinking about perception, I think is something that's going to be a problem, but we'll put it to one side for the moment, because obviously you hear and you do all sorts of other things when perceiving. And so Husserl wanted to develop a system. He started off as, of course, as a mathematical philosopher. I should say that.
Mm,
He's coming from mathematics into philosophy. He wanted to turn the critical gaze onto the uncritical natural gaze, right? He wanted to find a way of studying how we see the world, right? How the world comes in to our sphere of consciousness. And so he developed phenomenology as a way of doing that, right? So
mm,
it's basically, for him, it's a science. And there are transcendental phrases like um, if X, then Y, which can be applied universally wherever it seems appropriate. These are the transcendentals.
mm,
Right? There's ways of thinking. And so he began to sort this out. Now, there's a problem, though, as all phenomenology afterwards began to find, that when you turn your eye, as it were, towards the act of seeing, you're going to arrive at a paradox. You're going to arrive at a problem, right? There will never be that moment where you are simultaneously seeing and seeing yourself seeing, right? This will be a big problem, and it affects all of postmodernism. It affects all of postmodern architecture and art and everything, right? It's the inability to see yourself seeing, which is what Husserl had set out to do with his phenomenology.
mm,
And one could say hear oneself hearing too, or you can say
mm,
think about oneself thinking, right? So it's this what Hannah Arendt calls this reflux. The reflux is always possible, but you will never achieve an end. It will be this kind of infinite regress of trying to think about yourself thinking. And postmodern,
And while this is going on, sorry to jump in,
yeah,
but
go on.
in actual science, where you have quantum physics, where they seem to be getting to a point where this is a real problem actually in science, isn't it? In that our gaze, as it were, is affecting what we're seeing.
Absolutely. And all of this coincides. I mean, while Husserl is developing his phenomenology, Gödel is developing his theorem about Bertrand Russell,
Mm,
and Einstein is developing his theory of mass and space-time. And Einstein and Gödel were very, very good friends and sort of more or less retired together, two lonely old men at the end of the universe kind of thing.
mhm.
Um, but yes, we inherit from them the the inability to see how we arrive at true statements. We know they're true, but we don't know, we can't prove them. We can't say this is true because they're just true. And so in mathematics, that's easy. In our world, not so much. And so the problem of truth begins with this conflux of things. Heidegger was fascinated by theories of light coming from Faraday, from Einstein, from various people. And he was as fascinated by science as he was with other things. He just felt.
So we're talking around about 1920. Would this be 19?
I've jumped forward to, let's say, 1935.
About 1935,
Yeah,
yes. Now,
yeah,
I'm going to interject as because I'm sure people who are watching this are more like music fans. They're probably going, "Oh
yes.
my
Let's do
God,
that.
what this is heavy stuff," and how does this work? Well, what's very interesting is for me is that if you look at the Edwardian era, if you look at sort of around about 1910, we are looking at a world which seems very similar to 1870. There's a certain idea, and things are very solid, they're very Victorian, and they are very established, and the world is known. Science has come along, and technology has improved things, and all that type of thing. I always feel that this is now. I'm going to talk aesthetically now and move away from philosophy. I've always felt that when the Titanic goes down, the Titanic can be seen as a sort of Victorian idea of infallible rationalism, and it sinks. And we then go into the First World War, and they go in with that certain mindset. And I could see aesthetically, as soon as we emerge around about 1918, 1920, the world's a completely different place. And suddenly girls are on the back of aeroplanes in short skirts doing high kicks. Now, this is the aesthetic thing. You have the jazz age. And that for me can be seen as having some of the uh, um, influence of this sort of Victorian idea of solidity. So that would establish itself in art as the artists being in control of everything, and it's their vision. They have this incredible vision, and it's wrought, and that's what you're the receiver of that, and that suggests an idea of objective art. And we can think of the Royal Academy and painters submitting their paintings, and then it all starts to break down. Now, I spotted that if you're saying 1935 in the arts, we could see Picasso doing this in 1907 with Demoiselle d'Avignon. You could see Rites of Spring. We could see the beginnings of jazz. All these things are sort of actually the art is also making the same sort of claim aesthetically. Would you agree?
Yeah, but I would double down on that. I mean, I would think much earlier. I think with the Royal Academy, for instance, you've got someone like Baudelaire, who starts as a critic and then becomes a
Mm,
poet,
mm,
writing in the 40s and 50s, translating loads of Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan
mm,
Poe is the first modern writer, there's no question about it. And perhaps even already postmodern in a sense. And so Baudelaire is thinking about the Royal Academy, he's thinking about art, and he's thinking about all
mm,
sorts of ways in which this isn't good enough. And he wrote a very famous book called The Painter in Modern Life. And this was breaking away from all of those traditions in thinking about art in lots of different ways. So, the topic can change. Um, Today, we'd probably call this the aesthetic regime. An aesthetic regime has been born. I mean, we probably owe the origins of that to Hegel, but I won't go there.
mm. Without a
Um,
doubt, yes.
yeah.
I would say that, yes.
So
But
yeah, Baudelaire. I mean, and already by 1912, um, you've got Dada, you've got constructivism in Russia, you've got the futurists, the fascist futurists, for instance, you know, and you've got some of the most wild avant-garde approaches to creating that we've seen before or since, you know. Um, and it's really quite extraordinary. We've got surrealism, we've got long before the sort of 1930s things that I was
mm,
talking about. But Heidegger, of course, is too young for all of that. I mean, he gets it much later.
mm,
Um, and it's not absolutely certain that he's quite convinced by modernism either. People who are convinced by modernism in philosophy are people like Walter Benjamin, Theodor Adorno. Um, so, you know, Schoenberg is the name that you would
mm.
bandy out in that circle.
Yeah.
Um, and but Mina Loy, the poet, she's listening to jazz basically. By about 1919, she's listening to jazz. She says somewhere, poetry is words bewitched by music, and she's thinking about jazz. So yes,
So there's this motion in the 1920s and 1930s, and we can see a definite now an era that you could say I put it at 1912 with the sinking of the Titanic. You've just placed it there. There's a change culturally, and philosophy is informing that and reflecting that. We see it in science now. Science is like, oh, we don't really know what truth is. We know, and all that type of stuff. And time is not absolute, and the speed of light is, and all this type of thing is happening.
yeah,
And this moves through the 1950s and affects it. And I've tried to explore that on my channel, and I'm not going to do that here because I've done so many videos and it's very difficult to get in
mm,
that. But anyone watching the channel, what we're discussing here is the back end of that. This is
yeah,
the thing. Now, in I feel then in 1962, which I see as in the UK is marked by the trial to legalise Lady Chatterley's lover. A certain aesthetic argument emerges. And with that, I feel that there is a shift culturally. And that's the point I feel, you may argue with me, that we moved into the postmodern cultural epoch. The architecture changes from very modernist to this type of thing behind me, postmodernist. So aesthetically, there's an idea in postmodernism that we've got to the back end of modernism and now we've got to go back. And by in going back, it starts to question who the author is and are we just patching things together and all that type of stuff. And this is the postmodernist idea. Now, that's very clunky. And I think the meat and potatoes for you today, which I know you've got to go to the dentist.
yes. Sorry about
Yes,
that, but I'm
yeah.
okay for
So
now. I'm okay for a while.
the reality of time coming in, from outside you, and your bad tooth. It's
But, but I do think yes, you're right, and the trial of over Lady Chatterley, of course,
mm,
is a sort of a significant moment. And we do think historically in terms of significant moments. We can say like when this happens afterwards, everything has
yeah.
changed. And the sinking of the Titanic is well known for that. There's a very good poem by Thomas Hardy called "The Meeting of the Twain," which is about that iceberg and the Titanic, where he sums up what you just said about it. Um, to my mind.
Mm.
And, um, but but things had already changed by then. There's actually a fiction about a ship, much like I can't remember the name of the author now, but much like the Titanic from about 5 years before.
Oh, I've heard of this. Yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So the
Oh,
idea,
another thing that's very interesting is that when you look at, if we say that the Titanic is this sort of symbol of sort of Victorian
mm,
shoredness
mm,
in industry and technology, with its class system, rigid, and all that type of stuff. The iceberg, obviously, if you say an iceberg, that's a metaphor for the subconscious, and there's that emerging as well at this time. Isn't it? It's as though the shoredness of materialism banged up against the demons of the
yeah.
subconscious, and it came off worse. So I
But
don't think that
that
the Titanic is the beginning of anything. I think it's something that you can study
it
aesthetically and
quite,
go,
and it
yes,
might be
yeah.
strange. This is
It,
why this Thomas Hardy is so, so interesting and touching in a way.
mm,
Everything in Thomas Hardy is touching, but anyway, um, the the Trial of Lady Chatterley is another one, but there are all sorts of other things as well. Um, Aesthetically, I can see that. But if we start thinking about this in France, because this is Britain, isn't it?
mm. Yeah.
These battles were fought in the 19th century with Baudelaire, with Rimbaud,
Mm,
with Mallarmé, and and so it happens slightly differently in different places, but nonetheless, I think the point is good that things move into a new realm.
mm,
And it's absolutely true that postmodernism, the term, in its current usage, came into our sphere as an aesthetic term. It was to describe culture. In principle, it was to describe architecture. And it wasn't until the end of the 70s, people like Jean-Francois Lyotard, who wrote The Postmodern Condition, Jean Baudrillard, who wrote Simulations and Simulacra in 1980, and a little later, people like Frederick Jameson, who wrote Postmodernism and the Logic of Late Capitalism. So he's bringing his Marxist reading to bear on postmodern culture. So by this time, the early 80s, postmodernism is the term of the day, and it's on everyone's tongue. And I wonder whether by the end of the 20th century, it had ceased to be useful as
Oh,
an
this is what I
term.
wanted to rediscuss
Yeah,
with you, and I still think we need to hold back a little bit just to cover the postmodernist period,
sure.
because I think my great belief is these ideas, none of them can be absolute, and so they act as forces, and the pendulum swings. And I think the ideas that were in postmodernism, which for me the key ones would be about power relations coming from Foucault and the sort of totalitarian aspects of how power relations work. And I think we see in the civil rights movement in the 60s the positive attributes of looking at how power works in that sort of way, for example. I
But
can tell by your face you're going to.
no, I mean, yeah, I mean, I've studied Foucault at great length. It's not my favorite writer, but nonetheless, I do love it. I mean, we say this
Mm,
about musicians too, don't we? They're not my favorite, but
yeah.
I love them. But but power knowledge is like that phrase, power stroke knowledge, which suggests that we're talking about the same thing. It's a new thing called power knowledge. Um, is Needs to be understood in a slightly paradoxical way through with Foucault, which is potentially at odds with the rights movements, in fact, which is wanting
Oh,
to
I know, I know.
take
This
out.
is what I wanted to
Yeah,
talk to you about.
yeah,
Is that
sure.
if I criticise postmodernism, and I say because what the elephant in the room is at the moment is this idea of identity politics and an
Yeah,
atrophying of the postmodernist ideas that have now actually become an anathema to what postmodernism actually intended. And I'm pretty sure that Foucault, looking at the sort of what the woke sort of fringe, with them saying what people should do and what they shouldn't do, and you shouldn't allow to be doing, I think he'd be spinning in his grave if he could see that was going
yeah,
on. He was the complete opposite of that,
yeah.
and yet the as this enters into the academy, and I was at art college when I saw it enter into the academy, which is when I first became really interested in it. You now feel that that has really taken over the academy, and Foucault is a philosopher that is being pointed to substantiate ideas, which I think he would be again against. Same with the constructionists and the post-constructionists and Derrida's. Look at how words work. And this idea that we have to use certain pronouns and speech has to be compelled. I'm pretty sure Derrida would again
I think
find that abhorrent. So
suggests a terrible stretch to locate the use of pronouns. Suddenly, during the lockdowns, when all our classes were
mm,
on Zoom in Singapore, the students were coming up with all sorts of different pronouns that kind of
mm,
attached.
mm,
I mean, it's a relatively recent thing as
yeah,
a phenomenon, and it's something that we still haven't got the measure of yet, I don't think.
no,
But there's nothing in Derrida that would sanction the move
No,
towards
no.
no. I mean,
Yeah.
it doesn't make sense. But a pronoun in for that generation, I mean, they're working with linguists like Benveniste, who was a structuralist, really, and they didn't necessarily agree with him. But he established through the pronoun a division: the subject of the statement and the subject of the enunciation. And the subject of the enunciation is the fact that I am speaking. And the subject of the statement is what I say. Um, and this distinction has been so important in not just French philosophy, but philosophy since then. And people like Judith Butler, who probably is at root part of the pronoun
Mm,
move. And one has to look at people like Judith Butler to see
mm,
how this develops. And she is brilliant, but she's she's the one whose ideas establish sexuality as a fundamentally performative phenomenon.
mm.
And and that's a complicated idea that I don't particularly want to go into.
No,
But you
no.
can,
I'm trying to give a little bit of background
yeah,
of the people watching this is going, oh yeah, I've seen people arguing about this, and this is what's
yeah,
going on now, and
yeah,
actually
of course,
place it. It's not just this new phenomenon that's come out of a sort of this new political movement. That these have their roots going back, 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 and there's certain ideas that you can
yeah,
identify. And my take on this is that we in a sort of Western sort of liberal democracy where there was such an emphasis placed upon rationalism and utility and pragmatism that we forget the role of aesthetics in all of this. And all the way through this, I'm quite aware, with you having much greater knowledge of the history than me, that there seems to be a 20-year lag. That what the postmodernists are doing in the 1980s, the artists are doing in the 1960s. It's and in that same lag that we saw between Picasso and Heidegger. There's the same lag between
yeah.
say Bob Dylan and Derrida. That lag,
So they are
and
contemporary.
yeah, and even when you get like the sort of most postmodernist band on the planet, the one that's really informed modern culture, which would be Kraftwerk
Yeah,
in 1974 with Autobahn, it's still they're way ahead. That you know. So
yeah.
it's
I mean, I would agree with you on this. I mean, we're definitely not at odds over this.
mm,
I think the avant-garde is in the arts and certainly in music. And I think an understanding of music, this is actually very much in line with Foucault and Derrida.
mm,
Who Foucault is older than Derrida, but Foucault is
mm,
um, I mean Derrida's a, a contemporary of Bob Dylan. I mean they're
mm,
probably the same age.
yeah.
Derrida young because he got cancer, but they're probably roughly the same age, and they were coming
Mm.
up very radical ideas and very radical productions. Because I mean, I see Derrida as an artist as much as I see him as a philosopher. And it's a very
Would you
contemporary.
say would you say that that's what the postmodernist the idea of postmodernism, if we can step back and generalize, it is much more interested in aesthetics and art and how we feel and how we think and our how we work out our place in the universe and how we deal with all these contradictions that are apparent to anybody looking at the world and going, "Well, it doesn't seem that rational to me." Would you say that's what fundamentally postmodernism is trying to deal with?
Yeah, I and let's face it. If one talks about a philosophy, there's different things that one might imagine one means by the word
Mm,
philosophy. So I don't think of it as a worldview. I don't think philosophers are in the business of creating
mm,
worldview.
mm,
If in the academy someone seeks a worldview when they go to Foucault and all the critical writings on
mm,
Foucault, then it boggles the mind what they might end up with. But Foucault wasn't in the business of creating worldviews. He was in the business of asking questions and doing empirical analysis to find out what was going on, right? And I think that's what philosophers are about. They're trying to engage with the events of the world, and they're trying to do so in a philosophical way. They're trying to ask philosophical questions about what's going on in the world. So our discussions earlier on about the Titanic and about uh, Gottlob Frege and Kurt Gödel and Einstein, Schoenberg and Burke and Weber, Dada and Surrealism, right? This is a zeitgeist. This is what we call a zeitgeist. This is
Mm,
something that everyone is infected by one way or the other, whether they hate it or love it or whatever, right? It's a zeitgeist. This is what's happening in the world at the time. But philosophy needs to go beyond zeitgeists and worldviews, which is why, we're constantly referring to Plato and Aristotle, who had something to say about these things. I mean, that's an
mm.
interesting and bizarre idea, but they did. And so philosophy needs to go beyond the zeitgeist in a way. It needs to get a measure of what's happening, not from within the zeitgeist, but as a way of trying to comprehend it and trying to think about what happens next.
Well, this is very interesting
Mm.
because if we follow through the idea that the Titanic in 1912 was a very key date, and then the
Mm.
emergence of Bob Dylan and the Lady Chatterley's Lover court case and a few other events that I won't try and report here because I won't have the dates right, but roughly around about 1962, which is 50 years later. So if we forward 50 years after 1962, we come up with 2012, don't we? And I have noticed that there seems to be a shift which has been caused by the advent of mobile phones, smartphones. A lot of people are now attributing all sorts of problems to that point. So, for example, race relations in America, they've measured this, and people felt that race relations were improving all the way from 1962, all the way with the civil rights movement, and then they posit 2013, there's a downward trend, and
Very interesting. I haven't seen this.
I find this fascinating,
Yeah, me too.
and my opinion is that these postmodernists, like it sounds like I'm a real anti-postmodernist, and anyone who watches my channel will realize that my videos are full of postmodernist ideas all the time. I'm never really telling the truth. I don't have an idea of truth. I could do a video and lie my head off, and then other videos like this, I'm trying my hardest to concentrate to say something that's true. And there's all that going on.
Okay.
Um, but and I don't see myself as a philosopher. I see myself as a musician, and I see myself as championing aesthetic values. But I do think there's an argument that the postmodernist project atrophies around about 2012. It's no longer any use, and those ideas move into the realm of dogma. They move into the realm of ideology, and people start championing certain ideas, which you have probably rightly said don't actually have their um, roots in postmodernism, but the sort of ideas that worry me, is the sort of they're against the idea of freedom of expression, even more than freedom of speech. I'm an artist. I want to be able to express myself. And all the time, there seems to be a slow erosion going on. And I think that's because there is a fundamental distrust of the sort of liberal expression that emerged in the 1960s. I think it's on both sides, left and right. Obviously, the Conservatives think that we shouldn't be doing any of this and we should all be married with kids and doing that route. But on the Liberal side, it's all like, no, you should be a follow identity politics, and that's the moral code. And if you don't do that, you're a really bad person and you should be spoke to. And I get this in the neck regularly. You know, I was told yesterday by a guy that I really like. He's a good guy, but he turned around and said, he said, if you're even asking that question, Andy, then you are on the wrong side and you need to shut up.
About what was this about? I think I can
But
get.
I had said that I thought it was wrong to call the people rioting far right. I thought it was much more complex than that,
Yeah, quite.
which seems like a completely reasonable thing to say.
No, 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 quite.
you know,
I mean,
that's
yeah.
And so this is the very harsh reality of why we're in. This is why I'm being serious and not cracking any jokes on this video, because culturally we are in a bad place. I will look for philosophy for some answers because I think it is there, and I will look to art for some answers. But the terrifying things is the powers that be will shut that down, and you end up in a society like, say, China, where artist expression is a completely different thing to what it is here in the West, and has a completely different
Well,
value.
my Chinese friends, of which I have a great many because I was over in Singapore
Mm,
and visited China on many occasions. The rule in China, in the universities, is Marxism, if you want to be political. So if you
mm,
want to avoid falling out with the rule, you do postmodern philosophy because the party don't care, right? If you want to do postmodern philosophy, you won't get into trouble. So a lot of them do postmodern philosophy just as a way of getting their philosophy done.
mm. Yeah.
Um, and what the word postmodernism means changes from one context to another because of this kind of thing. Um, but really, they're interested in philosophers of a certain generation who were developing in certain ways. Now, I believe that philosophy has an impact later, and
Mm,
maybe art has an earlier impact. It's funny to me that that art tends to anticipate philosophy for the first part of the 20th century. And in the second part of the 20th century, art, the sort of thing you find in the Tate and places like
mm.
that, has become all theoretical. So it's kind of based on philosophical ideas and stuff like that. So there's a sort of an interesting,
But you know why that happened? It's because it's Marcel Duchamp. That's a work of genius. That urinal fountain. That's a work of genius because his intention wasn't to create a great piece of art. It was to put the art world in a mental conundrum that it can never escape from, so that everyone could get on with doing their like what they really wanted to do, which ended up being rock and roll and Jimi
sure,
Hendrix and Led Zeppelin and Sex Pistols, which I think you do see after that art moves somewhere else. It goes into film, it goes into rock and roll, it goes into pulp fiction, all that type of stuff. And then the postmodernists come along and sort of go, "There's actually a worth in this. There's a worth. There's things in this, which is really the thing that happens in the '60s when the sort of establishment goes and looks at black music
hmm,
and says there's something really good about this. I know they might be singing about dodgy things and all this type of stuff, but there's actually a real worth. And that's Dylan's genius, is to be able to spot that and
yeah,
then transmogrify that into a way of expressing yourself personally. And I think that becomes then very Nietzschean. Rock and roll is Nietzschean, whereas the big band jazz groups behind Frank Sinatra were much more sort of modernist in there. This is how I see it. But this doesn't
yeah.
help us right now. What do you think is going on in terms of postmodernism? Right? Do you agree with this idea? This is atrophied.
Yeah, I certainly do. I mean, in the aesthetic sense, postmodernism doesn't have much meaning or use anymore, even
No.
though we can speak intelligently and coherently about it. For a long time, people weren't able to do that, but
Mm.
there is a coherent explanation of postmodernism. I think you have an excellent one. Um, but I, it somehow doesn't fit the philosophies we're talking about.
Mm.
Which are very often philosophies about postmodernism, but not themselves postmodern in these
So
senses.
is there actually do you think there is actually a solution in these postmodernist
Yeah,
philosophers? Have we missed
I do.
something?
I
Wow.
do. I think reading the philosophers. I mean, I have a very small group of people. We go to the mountains in Italy once a year, and we discuss one contemporary book by someone who's still alive. There are a few people of this idiom who are still
Mm.
alive, and they die every day virtually. So we do that. And our discussions via the medium of these books take us right to where we feel we need to be. Now, I don't believe philosophy finds solutions to world historical problems, but it finds solutions in how to cope with them, how to deal with them. And I think one of the things that you've said, which is absolutely right, no one would contest it, the arrival of social media in certainly by 1912, 2012, 28 probably. Um, this has commanded so much attention in the field, in the university, which I've just
Mm.
left. Whole departments were set up to try to understand it. Um, and so there's a huge amount going on. That's one of the problems. but it's not the only one. The other
It's
problem,
not the only one. Yeah,
there's also climate change, and there's
climate. Yeah,
increasing authoritarianisms that you've already referred to, whether they're left or right. There's increase, all of this is happening, and it means that we're in a bad place. But before he died, Derrida's last work was a transcript of the year-long seminar that he gave every year. He gave a seminar every year right up until he died. The last one was called The Beast and the Sovereign, and he took three main texts. One was from Paul Celan, the great poet, French Jewish poet, where the phrase, "the world is gone, I must carry you," is the one that he concentrated on almost all year, right? And then he also looked at Robinson Crusoe and a bit of Heidegger, talking about animals and things. It's an amazing work, and we're still trying to get our heads around it, although he died in 2004, so earlier, I think. So it's an old work now, and it predates the situation we find ourselves in.
it's interesting you mentioned Robinson Crusoe
Yeah,
because there's this idea that you have the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and we all live in this lovely comfort because of that. But there's another counter idea to that that it actually comes from the novel, and it starts off with a sort of almost like pornographic novel, like those books like Moll Flanders, and then you get Robinson Crusoe, which really positions the person in their own universe and how they relate to that.
absolutely.
And everybody reads that, and they suddenly go, "Oh my God, I'm a person like that!" And
Yeah,
it's
sure.
a fantastic thing. And I must admit, the things you're saying, as I'm thinking them, they are making me feel a little bit better because it places us in a lineage which we should have a little bit more faith in, perhaps that this what's going on around us now could hopefully be the same sort of tumultuous things that were going on in around about the First World War into the 1920s, and we have to go through them.
Without making too straightforward a historical and analogy, which I don't think is a terribly good idea, it's nonetheless possible to situate ourselves in dark times. There's a
Mm,
very lovely essay by Heidegger called "What Are Poets For in Dark Times," which is a quotation from Rilke. Um, yes, it's not the first time we've come across dark
mm,
time in the human
no.
species. But Tristram Shandy, um, from early in the 20th century novel, is often regarded as the archetypal postmodernist text. But Daniel Defoe, Robinson Crusoe, yeah, sure. I mean, historically, there's so much available
Mm.
uh, for rethinking, rereading,
Well, what I'm getting
bringing
from
up
you
to
is that
date.
it's firing off a lot of thoughts where I'm going, oh yeah, that is as opposed to that as I thought. And that relates to that much closer than I thought. And these idea of trying to make sense of it by putting everything in the camps and in the different boxes, you start to realize no, because they, obviously in the art, there's the sort of romantic poets, and they have their, you know, roots in almost like a gothic idea, and you go back to books like The Monk, you know, this idea
Yeah.
of sort of the existential self, and of course that's influencing sort of the Victorian idea of modernism. So, and I'm starting to go, yes, these ideas are actually holding hands, aren't they? They're not fighting each other. They're holding hands and they're trying to help each other. And we, because once somebody once said to me that they said when the water's choppy around you, you shouldn't try and pat it still. You just need to stand still and let it settle. And I think that is the place we're in, which hints at a sort of drawing in. And you mentioned the environment. The environment is telling us to draw ourselves in,
Yeah.
but that's a much bigger philosophical idea. And my take on it is the arts, which have become overly perfectionist, overly platonic in a certain sense, overly postmodern in that there's no author and it's all just, you know, stuff jumbled up on top of each other, that we actually need to stop patting the water, stand still, and people need to stop being themselves again and just let it settle. We need to see some reality, which
I,
of
I wouldn't
course,
agree with you. I mean, but I'm going to have to rush off if I'm going to make
Yeah,
my.
yeah.
I'm sorry about that, because this is a very exciting conversation.
Well,
But
we will carry on. It's this is part one, and I think we've got to that
yeah,
point where I think we've done well, or you've done well, to sort of establish some stuff which people who aren't so well up on philosophical history and how it relates to art, that you could see at least the sort of conversations that nutters who are into this have, you know.
I
So
did want to say what one thing as a sort of a sign off about
yeah.
poor old Roland Barthes, who gets often gets the blame for there is no author, that sort of idea, because
Mm,
he wrote a short essay, Death of the Author. I mean, I think that's interminably misunderstood, that paper, and there's nothing in there that says there is no author. So like, where does this idea there's no author come from?
uh,
Unless of course it's the modernists, Duchamp.
yeah, and in a way. Uh, at the same time, in France, you had this sort of French New Wave, which is what I did my dissertation on at college,
Mhm.
was the
Yeah,
French New
yeah,
Wave, and they were really championing the idea of the author, and I was
sure.
very influenced by that.
Mhm.
Those two ideas. I think we have to find a way of getting these ideas to work together. We need to see the world as being more nuanced. This is something that comes back over and over again. And with all the discussion on Facebook with the current events that are going on, I just thought
Yes, I agree with you. Yeah.
we need to discuss nuance, and philosophers are all about nuance, which is why they will write a whole essay called "The Death of the Author," and then we will go, "Oh, yeah, the author's dead and God is dead," you know, and I
Yeah,
think therefore I am, and it
because
becomes
we only read
aphorisms.
the title. But the Death of the Author was commissioned by the art journal Aspen for its double issue on minimalism, and so Bart gave it to them, and it was a pretty groundbreaking journal issue, in fact, because it was a box, and in the box were tapes, records, films, written manuscripts like Bart's, and one or two other things as well. And it was about minimalism. And it, in a way, The Death of the Author is a minimalist artwork by Roland Barthes, and a rather beautiful one, and worth taking into account. But I
And
don't think the author
appreciating his
died.
authorship of it.
Well, no one is more of an author than Roland Barthes.
But
You know?
yes,
Yeah.
I have to be honest. When I was at art college, the main guy that we studied was Roland Barthes. That's the one I know
Oh,
about
really?
in terms
Yeah.
of the postmodernists. That where
Mythology.
I was, yeah, because I was taught that by people who knew about it. All the other ones I've tried to work it out myself. I'm an
Yeah.
autodidact. You know, I mean, my big hero is Colin Wilson, who is almost like a new existentialist, and I love the fact that he would just talk and he would just sort of let his brain go. But I could tell that you need to go to the dentist now, and
I
I hope
do.
that
I
all
should go.
goes
I
well.
should go. Yeah.
And
Thanks a lot, Andy.
thanks for coming on. Do you want to say goodbye to everybody?
Goodbye, everyone. Thank
And
you.
we will have John back. If you have got any questions that I'm sure you have, put them in the comments below. Me and John will keep an eye on them, and I will get him back forthwith. And thank you for watching this video. Of course, like, subscribe. You know, become a patron like John. These are the sort of people my patrons. I've got a high standard of patrons. I have. You know, no rubbish there. So you could come and have a chat with John if you come and join my patron. Maybe, I don't know. Thank you all. Bye bye.